It was a quiet afternoon on Maple Street when Jim, a dedicated mailman with 15 years of service, noticed something unusual during his daily route. As he approached Mrs. Henderson's house, a sweet elderly woman known for her cheerful smile and warm greetings, something caught his eye. Her pants were stained, and she seemed unsteady as she stepped out to retrieve her mail. Concerned, Jim offered to help, but Mrs. Henderson waved him off with a weak smile. Something didn't sit right with him. When he glanced at her front door left slightly ajar, he noticed an unusual smell wafting out. Peeking inside, Jim saw something alarming, a scene that made his heart race. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911, knowing time was of the essence. What Jim had just uncovered would soon shock the entire neighborhood. Jim couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as he waited for emergency responders to arrive. Mrs. Henderson was always so meticulous, her home spotless, her clothes tidy. The sight of her stained pants and frail demeanor was out of character, and the strange smell coming from the house only added to his worry. As Jim stood by the door, he noticed a faint trail on the floor leading further into the dimly lit hallway. He called out to Mrs. Henderson again, but her voice was faint and distant. His mind raced with possibilities. Was she hurt? Was someone else inside? Neighbors began to gather, whispering anxiously, but Jim kept his focus on the house. Every second felt like an hour as he stood there, torn between waiting for help and the urge to step inside and uncover what was really going on. As Jim stood frozen at the doorway, the faint sound of sirens in the distance gave him some relief, but his gut told him there wasn't much time. He glanced back at the concerned neighbors, some murmuring questions, others clutching their phones, unsure whether to step in or stay back. Inside, the dim hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. Shadows danced on the walls, and the faint smell he had noticed earlier was now stronger. Joe tried calling out again, louder this time. "Mrs. Henderson, are you okay?" A weak groan answered him, coming from the direction of the living room. His heart pounded. She sounded frail, almost desperate. As the sirens grew louder, Jim wrestled with the thought. Should he wait for help or risk stepping in alone? Every passing second felt heavier, the mystery pulling him deeper. The sound of Mrs. Henderson's faint groan lingered in Jim's mind, and his instincts kicked in. He stepped cautiously through the doorway, calling her name again. The house was eerily quiet except for the soft hum of a nearby fan and the creak of his footsteps on the wooden floor. In the living room, he froze. Papers were scattered across the floor, as if someone had been searching for something. A glass of water lay tipped over on the coffee table, its contents dripping onto the carpet. The smell was stronger now, and Jim's eyes darted to the hallway, where the faint trail he'd seen earlier led toward the back of the house. "Mrs. Henderson," he called again, his voice trembling. The groan came once more, louder this time, sending chills down his spine. Something was terribly wrong. Jim followed the trail cautiously, his pulse quickening with each step. The hallway grew darker as he approached the back room. He pushed open a partially closed door and froze. Mrs. Henderson was slumped on the floor, clutching her side, her face pale and drenched in sweat. "Jim," she whispered weakly, her voice barely audible. But before he could move closer, something caught his eye, a figure darting past the back window. It was quick, almost a blur, but unmistakable. Someone else had been in the house. His heart raced as he glanced back at Mrs. Henderson, torn between staying to help her and checking to see who, or what, had just disappeared. The sirens were now deafeningly close, but so was the growing fear that whatever had caused this wasn't over. Jim's hand shook as he tried to make sense of it all. Jim knelt beside Mrs. Henderson, his hands trembling as he tried to keep her awake. "Help is on the way," he said softly, though his eyes kept darting toward the back window where the figure had vanished. She gripped his arm weakly, her lips trembling as she muttered, "The box." They wanted the box. Before he could ask more, the sound of footsteps approached rapidly from the hallway. Jim spun around, his heart pounding. It wasn't the paramedics. It was a young man, disheveled and frantic, holding an old, battered box. "I didn't mean to hurt her," the man blurted out, tears streaming down his face. "She wouldn't give it to me." The paramedics burst in moments later, taking charge of the scene. As Mrs. Henderson was lifted onto a stretcher, Jim stared at the man in the box, a mixture of anger and confusion clouding his thoughts. When the police arrived and opened the box, they revealed its contents. Faded letters and photographs, deeply personal, and likely holding secrets from a long-lost past. Mrs. Henderson, barely conscious, whispered, "My grandson. He's lost Jim." The realization hit him like a wave. The man was her estranged grandson, desperate and broken, trying to recover a piece of a family he felt he had lost. Though the danger had passed, the tangled emotions and unresolved history left Jim with a heavy heart, wondering how such a story could spiral into chaos, and if it could ever truly heal. As the ambulance pulled away, Jim stood on the porch, watching the scene settle. Mrs. Henderson was safe now, and the young man, her grandson, was being taken into custody, though it was clear his actions stemmed more from desperation than malice. Later, Jim learned from the neighbors that the grandson had fallen on hard times and believed the box held something valuable. Instead, it contained memories, snapshots of a life Mrs. Henderson had never shared, including letters from her late husband and pictures of a family long fractured. In the days that followed, Mrs. Henderson began to recover, and Jim visited her regularly, their bond stronger than ever. The incident left the neighborhood with a renewed sense of community, and for Jim, a reminder that even in the smallest gestures, like noticing a stain, lives can be forever changed.